Long before the internet, before cancel culture, before the movement gave language to pain that had lived in silence for generations, there existed a world where fame meant immunity, and being a rock star wasn't just about selling records. It was about dominance, about owning the room, the night, and anyone who got pulled into their orbit. In the 1970s, when rock and roll was a religion, the backstage wasn't merely a location, it was a sacred ritual cloaked in chaos. The parties never ended, the drugs never stopped, and the girls? They were young, far too young. They were labeled groupies, worshipped, fantasized about, immortalized in songs and photographs. But they were almost never protected, never truly heard, rarely seen for what they were. Children disguised as adults in a game designed by men. Lori Mattix was only 14 when her name was whispered into that world. She wasn't a musician. She wasn't signed to a label. But she was infamous along the Sunset Strip, known for her porcelain beauty, her age, and her closeness to the stars. Today, she recounts her story with a conflicted sort of nostalgia, remembering dim hotel rooms, secret phone calls, and the intoxicating feeling of being chosen by men who would later be canonized as legends. David Bowie, Jimmy Page, gods of rock, icons, men who were decades older than the teenage girls they invited into their beds. For years, stories like Lori's were passed around like folklore, told with grins, wrapped in glamour, accepted as part of the rock star fantasy. These weren't cautionary tales. They were campfire stories, romanticized, celebrated, and never questioned. Groupies weren't framed as victims. They were envied. They were the lucky ones. But when the movement ignited in 2018, pulling down giants across industries and dragging buried truths into daylight, Lori Mattix's story rose again. And this time, it wasn't met with applause. It was met with outrage, confusion, and long overdue accountability, because Lori wasn't a one-off. Her story echoed the lives of countless girls, minors groomed in club corners, shared between tour buses labeled as muses, when the truth was far more sinister. And when old interviews were replayed, when timelines were re-examined, an even darker truth came into focus. People had always known. The media knew. The music executives knew. The fans knew. And still, silence prevailed. Because when fame is blaring loud enough, it drowns out even the most desperate cries. Lori Mattix didn't start a movement. She didn't take legal action. She didn't rally behind a podium or march with slogans. She simply told her truth, again. But this time, the world had changed. This time, someone was listening. And what they heard wasn't just a personal confession. It was a cultural reckoning, a brutal confrontation with everything we allowed to pass as normal, as glamorous as rock and roll. They called it glamour. They called it romance. They called it freedom. But for girls like Lori Mattix, being chosen by a rock star didn't feel like empowerment. It felt like a blur, like standing too close to a fire and pretending the burns were blessings. She was 14. Jimmy Page was 28. David Bowie even older. And the world didn't flinch. It didn't question. It cheered. The music industry, the media, the fans, everyone knew, and everyone turned the other way, because these men weren't just artists. They were deities. And in a culture drunk on charisma, talent, and rebellion, the concept of consent became a whisper in a roaring crowd. The law was a ghost, and the girls, they were ornaments, background props in a fantasy that wasn't theirs. For Lori, it began with flattery, a backstage pass, a handler who treated her like a secret to be delivered, not a person to be protected. She recalls it now with a fragile blend of wonder and sorrow, like someone still trying to convince herself that what happened was meaningful, that she wasn't just a character in someone else's twisted mythology. And that's the quiet heartbreak, because Lori, like so many others, had to interpret her abuse in real time, without the right words, without protection, without a culture willing to recognize that a 14-year-old girl cannot give a man like Jimmy Page the kind of consent the law and morality demand. There were hotel rooms cloaked in silence, expectations left unspoken but never unclear, rules you learned quickly. Don't ask questions, don't say no, don't tell anyone, because these men weren't just older, they were icons, and if You said the wrong thing. If you dared to break the illusion, you didn't just lose their attention. You lost access. You lost your place. You lost your sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself. So Lori played along. She told her stories like war tales with a smirk and a shrug until the world shifted, until other women found their voices, until cracked open the stage lights and let the shadows speak. And suddenly, Lori's story wasn't wild. It wasn't sexy. It was sobering, because this wasn't love. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't just another wild night in rock and roll history. It was grooming. It was coercion. It was abuse, camouflaged in eyeliner, leather jackets, and magazine covers. And what makes it truly chilling isn't just the age gap or the famous names. It's how deeply embedded the silence was, how willing we were to protect the myth over the truth, how easy it was to worship men who stole girlhoods in plain sight. That's the real tragedy of Lori Mattix's story. Not just what happened to her, but how little anyone cared. How willingly we handed over our conscience in exchange for a concert ticket or a signed vinyl. Because when David Bowie walked into a room, no one asked who the girl on his arm was. They asked for a photo, they handed him the keys. Even if the room he walked into was a 14-year-old girl's vulnerability, the rock star fantasy was never just about music. It was about control. It was about men who knew they could get away with anything because the world loved them too much to hold them accountable. And Lori Mattix didn't audition for that story. She was dragged into it, painted, into the background like set decor. She was told it was special, that it was love. And only after the curtain fell, years later, did she start to see the truth for what it was. Something she didn't give, something that was taken, something that glittered on the outside, but underneath was nothing but theft. The truth was never hidden. It was just never taken seriously. Interviews from the 70s, magazine spreads, behind-the-scenes footage, they all told the story in plain sight. There was Lori Mattix, Sable Starr, and countless other teenage girls draped over men twice their age, men whose names lit up marquees and whose records broke every chart. Nobody concealed it. They didn't have to. The world didn't care. The photographers kept snapping. The journalists kept writing. The tour managers kept moving bodies from one room to the next. No one stopped to call it what it was, because calling it rock and roll was easier than calling it exploitation. And that's the uncomfortable truth. We didn't miss the signs, we ignored them. So when Lori's story resurfaced in 2018 at the peak of the movement, the public didn't react with shock, they reacted with guilt. Her interviews weren't new. Her truth hadn't changed. What changed was us. A generation raised to glorify icons finally had the language to confront what had always been there. But even then, the backlash came hard. She was accused of seeking fame, of rewriting history, of attacking legends, as if those legacies weren't already built on stolen youth and buried silence. Fans who once wept over their heroes refused to shed a tear for the girls, writing it off as just the times, as if morality has an expiration date, as if consent becomes irrelevant when the music is good enough. A 14-year-old can't meaningfully consent, not to a man with security guards, champagne, and a world engineered to silence resistance. And in that moment, the world exposed its true loyalty. It wasn't to truth or justice or healing. It was to comfort, to nostalgia, because facing what those songs cost meant watching idols crumble. Lori's story wasn't just a confession. It was a mirror held up to a culture that always knew better but never wanted to do better. And even with receipts in hand, photos, quotes, timelines, the world hesitated to listen. Because sometimes, it's easier to preserve the myth than to reckon with the damage. But Lori kept speaking, not to erase the music, but to demand honesty. To say, stop pretending we didn't know, because we did. We just didn't want to admit it. They were called groupies. That word, glossy, careless, seductive, became their identity. Not girls, not minors, not victims, just groupies. A term that sanitized what was really happening, making children sound like co-conspirators in some glamorous backstage fantasy. It stripped them of innocence, of protection, of truth. Behind the velvet ropes, past the hotel hallways and dressing rooms, they were just teenagers, some barely into puberty, wandering into a world built for men, not for them. And no one stood guard. Not the roadies who looked the other way, not the publicists who kept the image spotless, not the venues that waved them through without IDs, not the journalists who quoted them in magazines like exotic novelties. Child, muses dressed up for a grown man's game. Lori Mattix wasn't the exception. She was one of many. Sable Starr, Connie Hamzy, and dozens of other girls whose names never made it to liner notes or interviews, but whose bodies were part of the story. They were found outside tour buses, inside nightclubs, leaning against the edge of stardom, drawn in by the music, the promise of love, the illusion of belonging. What they got instead was attention that masqueraded as affection, manipulation, that wore the costume of fame. And nobody told them it was wrong, because when you're young and your idol notices you, it doesn't feel like danger. It feels like arrival. The industry didn't just fail these girls, it fed on them. The myth of the rock star was built not only on music, but on conquest, excess, domination. Underage girls were part of the dream package, passed around, photographed, turned into punchlines or poetry. Their bodies were souvenirs of power. And when the music stopped, when the doors closed and the stage lights dimmed, no one asked them if they were all right. No one stayed. Their pain was erased, shrunk into a passing line in a memoir, a lyric in a hit, a joke in an interview. Even now, in a world reshaped by there's an eerie resistance to revisiting the so-called golden era of rock, we want to protect the legends. We want to keep the magic untouched. But magic that demands silence isn't magic, it's manipulation. Lori Mattix's voice, fragile yet unyielding, cracked the illusion. She forced the music industry to confront the reality that the soundtrack of a generation was composed alongside the erasure of girls who were too young to fight back. And while many of the men who shaped that era are long gone, the culture they thrived in still lingers, a culture of denial, of nostalgia over truth, of asking, why bring this up now, as if time absolves harm? But it doesn't. Someone has to speak. Someone has to remember. Because if we don't protect the girls, growing up today, we are no different from those who let it happen before. And no amount of music, no matter how legendary, can ever be worth the silence it was built upon. The world had worshipped these men, David Bowie, the chameleon who reinvented sound and self with every breath, who turned gender into art and rebellion into melody. Jimmy Page, the haunted genius behind Led Zeppelin, whose riffs bent the air and whose presence commanded awe. Their faces adorned T-shirts, their lyrics lived in diaries, their music played at both weddings and funerals, woven into the very fabric of life across generations. They weren't just admired, they were untouchable, elevated beyond criticism, shielded by the sheer weight of their cultural contribution. But in 2018, the veil began to tear. For the first time, the conversation shifted, not away from their art, but toward the men behind it. When Lori Mattix's story resurfaced, no longer romanticized, no longer buried under nostalgia, it struck a deep generational nerve. For some, it was denial. For others, rage. But for many, it was grief, because believing Lori meant undoing decades of mythology. It meant admitting that the gods of rock were also men, flawed, reckless, and capable of profound harm. It meant asking how many stories like Lori's had been discarded to preserve a fantasy. It meant unpinning posters, not with hate, but with sorrow. And yet, this was never about canceling legends. It wasn't about banning songs or burning records. It was about telling the whole story, a story that included not just platinum records and sold-out arenas, but also the unheard cries of girls too young to consent and too silenced to resist. For decades, rock history had been a monologue, the story of men with guitars, with record deals, with power. But Lori Mattix cracked that monologue open and demanded it become a conversation. The rewriting of history didn't come from vengeance. It came from necessity. Because what we choose to glorify shapes what we choose to excuse. And if we excuse the exploitation of a 14-year-old girl because the man who hurt her could write a masterpiece, then we are choosing art over ethics, sound over soul. What message does that send to the next generation of fans, of artists, of girls hoping to find their voice in a world still tilted in favor of fame? A reckoning isn't the end of music. It's the beginning of integrity. It doesn't erase Bowie's brilliance or Led Zeppelin's influence, but it insists that talent cannot be a shield from truth. That legacy must be wide enough to hold both genius and accountability, and that nostalgia, no matter how beloved, should never come at the cost of erasing someone's pain. For Lori Mattix, the rewriting of rock history wasn't about revenge. It was about release, about finally saying, I was there, I was real, I was a child. And what happened to me wasn't iconic, it was wrong. There is no justice that can undo. What happened to Lori Mattix? No headline, no apology, no revised documentary or edited biography can restore what was taken from her. Her innocence, her sense of safety, her right to choose were stolen in plain sight, in a world that knew better and still stood silent. But if history owes her anything, if it owes anything to the countless girls like her, it's this: to stop pretending they weren't there, to stop glamorizing their pain, to stop calling it rock and roll when it was abuse dressed in glitter and amplified through sound systems. The music industry may never offer an official apology. The men at the AE's center, idolized, immortalized, may never take accountability. But the culture that enabled them, the one that turned young girls into props and trauma into punchlines, that culture can still be rewritten. And it begins not with outrage, but with listening, with believing, with naming, with giving these women more than a footnote in someone else's success story. It begins by admitting that the songs we love were sometimes born in rooms full of silence and power imbalance, where girls were seen, used, and then forgotten. What do we owe them? We owe them space. We owe them truth. We owe them inclusion. In the history they helped shape, not as decoration, but as the backbone of a culture too long written by men with microphones. These girls were the unsung chorus, taught that their silence was part of the dream, that to be chosen was to be lucky, and to speak up was to disappear. They weren't complicit. They were conditioned. They were told this was love. This was fame. This was how legends were made. But now we know better, and knowing means we cannot go back. We owe it to Lori Mattix and every survivor to build an industry that doesn't just celebrate talent, but safeguards the vulnerable. An industry that stops calling girls muses when it really means exploited. One that no longer hides behind nostalgia when truth knocks at the door. Lori's story may have started in the shadows of hotel rooms, whispered beneath the roar of concerts and the haze of stardom, but it ends in clarity, in defiance, in a voice no longer willing to be muted for the sake of someone else's legend. She didn't headline a tour or top the charts, but she did something far more powerful. She told the truth, and that truth is a light the world can no longer dim. Consent isn't just a word, it's a context. It's about age, power, pressure, and clarity. And when you're 14 years old, surrounded by fame, handlers, and the unspoken expectation to say yes, there is no real choice. Lori Mattix may have smiled for photos. She may have walked into hotel rooms. But none of that makes what happened consensual. Not legally, not morally. And yet for decades, the public pretended it did. Because it's easier to believe in consent than to confront coercion, especially when it means questioning the legacy of the people we've worshipped. The machinery of fame protected the men and erased the girls. Record labels turned blind eyes. Managers kept the doors closed. Journalists asked the wrong questions, or none at all. Everyone played their part, not just because they were afraid, but because they were complicit. Protecting the brand was more important than protecting the girl. And when groupies were too young, too vulnerable, too unstable, they weren't helped. They were discarded. And the show went on. This isn't just a story of rock stars and girls. It's a story of an entire culture that doesn't understand what consent looks like when one person holds all the power and the other is too young to even know they can say no, Stories like Lori Mattix's lived in the corners of music history. They were whispered, dismissed, or romanticized. But after 2017, something cracked. When women across the globe began telling their stories of assault, harassment, and survival, often involving powerful men and long-protected institutions, the conversation shifted. The world began to see that abuse wasn't always violent. It could be charismatic, subtle, wrapped in opportunity and fame. Lori didn't come forward with a press conference. Her interviews already existed, but suddenly, people started listening differently. They stopped hearing an edgy tale of rock and roll glory and started hearing a child being manipulated. They started seeing how normal it had become to ignore the girls on the edge of the stage, the ones the camera never lingered on, the ones who carried the weight of someone else's stardom long after the curtain dropped. Didn't just give survivors a voice. It gave listeners the ears they never had before. It taught a new generation how to question what used to be called just the culture. And it gave Lori Mattix, without a lawsuit, without a movement of her own, the power of recognition. Her pain was no longer niche. It was part of the broader chorus of women saying, "We were there, you just didn't see us."